Section 1 will open with a sense of tension, a voice that sounds like it belongs in a dark theater, drawing the audience into the myth of Lucky Luciano not with statistics or raw facts, but with atmosphere. Imagine New York in the 1930s, smoke curling out of speakeasies, police sirens echoing in the distance, and the quiet whisper of names spoken in fear. In this opening act, the viewer is asked not just to learn about a gangster, but to confront a paradox. How did one man born to a poor Sicilian family rise to control an empire larger than some corporations, not only through money but through something far more enduring, fear? This is not just history, it is psychology, it is power, it is the anatomy of control. The story does not begin with Luciano's childhood, but rather with the man he became, the figure who stood above the chaos, orchestrating crime as if it were a symphony. His enemies respected him, his allies feared him, and yet both depended on him. The genius of his reign was not that he killed more men or made more money, but that he understood people, their insecurities, their ambitions, their secret weaknesses. Luciano transformed fear into a kind of invisible currency, one that bought him silence, loyalty, and obedience at a scale the underworld had never seen. In this introduction we set the tone by asking the audience, what is stronger, love or fear? The answer, at least in Luciano's world, was already written in blood and silence. To make the audience feel this truth, the narration will move through short cinematic vignettes. A low-level street hustler shivering outside a club after hearing he is wanted by Charlie Lucky. A politician pocketing an envelope, knowing refusal would mean ruin. A rival gangster sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, glancing nervously at the door, half expecting it to swing open with his killers inside. These are not just fragments of underworld life. They are examples of how Luciano's name alone carried the weight of inevitability. Fear meant survival and Luciano weaponized it like no other. But fear in his hands was not loud. It was quiet. It lived in the way he could look a man in the eyes and smile, while that man felt his blood run cold. He rarely raised his voice, rarely drew attention to himself in public, and yet his presence carried a force of intimidation far beyond the visible. That psychological balance, charm wrapped around steel, is what made him unique. He did not just build the mafia's power structure. He became its living symbol, a reminder that the most dangerous threats are often delivered in whispers, not shouts. The introduction also foreshadows the arc of the story. A man who built an empire on intimidation, who organized chaos into order, but who also discovered that fear has a price. For every man kept silent, there was another plotting revenge. For every ally cowed into submission, there was a prosecutor outside the underworld who could not be reached by fear. As the story unfolds, the audience will see not only Luciano's rise and triumph, but the cracks in his empire, the moments when fear itself became a double-edged sword. To ground this in today's world, the opening closes with a reflective angle. Why does Lucky Luciano still matter? Because fear as a tool of power has never disappeared. Dictators use it. Corporations use it. Leaders in every corner of society often turn to fear when trust is too fragile. Luciano's genius was to refine this into an art, one that reshaped the American underworld forever. The film invites the audience to step into his world, to feel the smoky rooms, the tense silences, the sudden betrayals, and to ask themselves what they would do if faced with the choice of obeying Lucky Luciano or risking everything. By the end of the opening act, the viewer is immersed in both the allure and the menace of Luciano's empire. They understand that this is not just a gangster biography, but a psychological journey into the mechanics of control. It is a story about power, how it is gained, how it is kept, and how it destroys. New York in the early 20th century was a city bursting with contradictions. The Statue of Liberty promised freedom, but the streets of the Lower East Side whispered something very different. Survival meant cunning, muscle, and an acceptance of brutality. This is where the story of organized crime before Lucky Luciano begins. In a world of fractured power, of small-time bosses clinging to influence, of blood spilled over street corners and neighborhood loyalties, the underworld was not yet an empire. It was a patchwork of gangs and cliques, each bound by ethnicity, each refusing to bend to the other. Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, every community that had spilled into New York carried with it its own codes, its own ways of hustling for a living. Violence was constant, unpredictable, and often senseless. At the center of this world were the Italian crime bosses who brought the old world ways with them. They demanded tribute, they expected silence, and they waged endless wars against one another for dominance. The mafia existed, yes, but it was a raw, chaotic thing, not the structured corporation it would one day become. These bosses ruled like medieval lords, relying on family bloodlines and Sicilian codes of honor. Betrayals were answered with stabbings in alleys or bullets in saloons. Nothing was streamlined. Nothing was rational. The Castellamarese War, which would erupt later, was the natural consequence of years of simmering rivalry among Sicilian factions, each unwilling to yield. To ordinary New Yorkers this was background noise, gangsters killing gangsters. But to the young Salvatore Lucania, growing up in this climate, it was an education in both the dangers and the opportunities of the streets. Prohibition poured gasoline on the fire. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, the underworld transformed overnight. Suddenly the stakes were higher, the money larger, the violence deadlier. Bootlegging empires sprang up with astonishing speed. Men like Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain, saw the opportunity to supply liquor to an entire thirsty nation, and they did it by stitching together gangs of every background. Yet even in this golden business opportunity, the chaos of the old ways remained. Irish gangs controlled the docks, Italians claimed neighborhoods, Jewish hustlers took the risks with smuggling. Cooperation was fragile. One insult could spark a gangland war that left bodies piled on sidewalks. Politicians and police were never far from this equation. Corruption was rampant. A judge might take bribes from one gang while police detectives pocketed envelopes from another. No one trusted anyone. The very system that should have kept crime in check was instead part of the game. For the immigrant underclass this was normal. Survival depended on who you knew and what you could pay. And if you couldn't pay you obeyed. Fear was already a currency, but it was wielded clumsily, crudely, and without long-term vision. This was the world before Luciano, a world that screamed for organization, for someone who could take the disparate pieces and turn them into something enduring. Into this landscape came the influence of old Sicilian traditions. Omerta, the code of silence, and vendetta, the blood feud. These traditions gave shape to the violence, but they also trapped the mafia in endless cycles of retribution. One insult meant retaliation, and retaliation led to war. Generations of Sicilian gangsters brought with them not only skills in extortion and intimidation, but also a stubborn resistance to change. They distrusted outsiders, clung to family ties, and placed honor above profit. For them, a slight could matter more than a fortune. And while this culture bred loyalty and ferocity, it also guaranteed instability. In the background of all this, ordinary life for immigrants was unforgiving. Tenement buildings overflowed with families, children scavenged for work in sweatshops, and prejudice from the native-born Americans limited opportunities. The line between legality and illegality was thin. For many, joining a gang was not a choice but a necessity. A boy could earn more in a day running errands for a gangster than in a week shining shoes. This reality fed the underworld a constant supply of recruits, young men hardened by poverty, eager for respect, and willing to do whatever it took to rise. Luciano was one of them, but unlike most, he saw the flaws in the system. The underworld of New York before Luciano was like a chessboard with no strategy. Pieces moved aimlessly, each player guarding his own corner, with no vision of the whole game. Bloodshed kept order only temporarily, alliances were brittle, and the city's criminal wealth was squandered in petty rivalries. What it needed was a leader who could look past the short-term gains, past the ethnic feuds, and envision crime as a business, scalable, efficient, and unshakable. Luciano would be that figure, but for now the world was still waiting, trapped in cycles of violence it could not escape. The section closes with a sense of foreshadowing. Against this backdrop of chaos, a new kind of criminal mind was preparing to emerge. Where others saw only streets to control, Luciano would see a kingdom. Where others killed for honor, he would kill for efficiency. And where others ruled by brute force, he would perfect the art of ruling through fear that was quiet, precise, and permanent. The stage is set. America before Luciano was a battlefield. What came next would be empire. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, a place marked by poverty, superstition, and the long shadow of the mafia's old traditions. His family, like so many others, dreamed of a better life across the ocean. When he was just a boy, they boarded a ship bound for America, carrying little more than hope and desperation. For young Salvatore, stepping onto the bustling docks of New York meant entering a world that was as unforgiving as Sicily, only bigger, louder, and faster. The Lower East Side was a maze of overcrowded tenements, the air thick with coal smoke, the streets alive with pushcarts, street vendors, and kids scrambling for nickels. Life here was not about chasing dreams. It was about surviving one more day. From the very beginning, Luciano understood that survival required toughness. The immigrant children on the Lower East Side formed their own gangs, not out of choice but necessity. They defended street corners, stole coal to keep warm, and fought each other with fists, bricks, and knives. It was a brutal initiation into manhood, and Salvatore, slight but sharp-eyed, quickly learned that strength was not just about muscle. It was about nerve, wit, and knowing when to strike. By his teenage years he had Americanized his name to Charles, or Charlie, trying to fit into a city that never welcomed outsiders. The streets gave him an identity, but they also gave him scars. As a boy, Luciano discovered that crime paid better than honest labor. For a few pennies he could shine shoes or deliver goods. But for a few dollars he could run errands for gangsters, carry messages, or smuggle goods. By his mid-teens he was already dabbling in extortion, charging other kids protection money to cross certain streets. If they didn't pay, they paid in bruises. This ruthless streak, combined with a natural charisma, earned him respect among his peers. He was clever enough to avoid unnecessary fights and bold enough to win the ones he couldn't avoid. It was around this time that the nickname Lucky began to follow him, partly because of his uncanny ability to escape police, and partly because of an incident where he survived being stabbed and beaten by rivals. He wore the name like a badge of destiny. Yet Luciano's genius was not only in violence. Even in his youth he showed an instinct for organization. While other kids wasted their money on cheap thrills, he began forming small cliques, pooling resources, and creating rules. He saw opportunity in every racket: gambling, card games, bootlegging during his teenage years when the Volstead Act took effect, even prostitution. He realized early that money and power went hand in hand, and both could be multiplied if you had the right people around you. It was this insight that brought him into contact with other ambitious young men: Meyer Lansky, a Jewish kid with a mathematical brain; Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, violent and fearless; and Frank Costello, smooth and politically connected. Together, these boys represented a new breed of gangster, one not bound by old ethnic rivalries but by shared ambition. Luciano's rise in the teenage underworld was marked by balance. He was not the most feared; Siegel carried that reputation. He was not the most cerebral; Lansky filled that role. But Luciano had something rarer: vision. He could see beyond the street fights and petty rackets. He believed the underworld could be more than a collection of gangs. It could be a system, almost like a government, one that taxed, protected, and expanded. This thinking was radical in a time when most bosses clung to Sicilian traditions, obsessed with family honor and blood feuds. For Luciano, blood was not sacred; money was. But the path upward was never without risk. Luciano's teenage years were a constant test of survival. He was arrested more than once for theft and assault, but he always managed to slip free, either through luck, corruption, or sheer nerve. Each arrest added to his street credibility. To many he was a kid destined to burn out young. But to those who looked closer he was calculating. He studied the men above him, the bosses who ruled Little Italy with fists and fear, and he learned what to copy and what to discard. He saw that violence kept men in line but also bred rebellion. He saw that bribes worked better than threats when dealing with police and politicians. And he saw that charm, the ability to shake hands with an enemy and smile, could be more dangerous than a gun. The making of Lucky Luciano was also shaped by the broader environment of New York. The city was a melting pot of ambition and corruption. Politicians sold favors, policemen took bribes, and businessmen looked the other way so long as profits kept flowing. For a poor immigrant boy the lesson was clear: the system was rigged, so why play fair? Luciano was not just a product of his environment, he was its mirror. He embodied the survival instincts of millions of immigrants, but he pushed those instincts to their extreme, turning them into weapons of power. By the time Luciano reached his early 20s, he was no longer just another street kid. He was a figure people noticed. He dressed sharp, carried himself with confidence, and surrounded himself with allies who complemented his weaknesses. His legend was still in its infancy, but already people whispered his name with caution. He was Lucky, the boy who always survived, the hustler who always found an angle, the gangster who seemed destined for something bigger. This section closes with the sense that Luciano's rise was not inevitable, but it was unstoppable. The Lower East Side had given him all the tools he needed: toughness, cunning, a network of allies, and a vision beyond his years. Where others saw only the next hustle, Luciano was already planning the empire to come. He was not yet the architect of the American Mafia, but the foundations of that genius, the genius of fear, of order, of control, were already being laid in the dirty streets of immigrant New York. Luciano's early 20s were a turning point, the years when he shifted from being just another tough street kid into a man who understood the deeper psychology of power. What separated him from the hundreds of other young gangsters running rackets in New York was not just luck, or even ambition. but a talent for reading people. Where others relied purely on muscle or raw violence, Luciano studied human nature as if it were a tool to be sharpened. He learned when to intimidate, when to flatter, when to bribe, and when to let silence do the work of 1,000 threats. It was during this period that he discovered the delicate balance between respect and fear, and that fear, if properly applied, was the most reliable form of control. One of the first lessons came from his friendships with men outside the Sicilian mold. In a world where Italian bosses demanded strict loyalty to blood and tradition, Luciano did something almost unthinkable. He allied himself with Jews and Irishmen. With Meyer Lansky he found a partner who understood numbers, discipline, and strategy. Lansky's calm intelligence balanced Luciano's instinctual leadership. With Bugsy Siegel, he had a volatile enforcer whose sheer capacity for violence could frighten even the most hardened rivals. And with Frank Costello he gained an insider to the world of politics, someone who could smooth relationships with police and lawmakers. Luciano realized that power could not be limited to one ethnicity, one tradition. If money was the new language of the underworld, then alliances had to stretch across every barrier. It was a revelation that would define his empire. But alliances alone weren't enough. Luciano began experimenting with new ways of running his crew. Instead of treating loyalty as something to be demanded, he created incentives. Those who worked for him made money, real money, and those who betrayed him faced not only violence but the certainty of obliteration. He understood psychology at every level. For his street soldiers, fear of death kept them in line. For politicians and businessmen, fear of exposure or financial ruin was enough to make them obey. He recognized that fear could be tailored, shaped like clay depending on the target. It didn't always have to be bloody. Sometimes it was a threat whispered in a bar. Other times it was the quiet reminder of what had happened to someone who crossed him last month. The Castellammarese War of the late 1920s provided another brutal education. Luciano was caught between two aging bosses, Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, each clinging to old-world traditions. They ruled through paranoia, demanding absolute obedience, launching wars over pride, and destroying fortunes in the process. Luciano saw their flaws with clarity. Masuria was greedy, short-sighted, and violent without strategy. Maranzano was cunning but obsessed with his Roman-style fantasies, demanding to be called boss of bosses. Both men confused respect with fear. They made men obey but they could not inspire loyalty. Luciano, watching from the inside, concluded that their time was over. If the mafia was to survive in America, it needed to be run like a business, not a feudal kingdom. During this war, Luciano refined his own tactics. He learned how to play both sides, how to smile at Masuria while quietly plotting his downfall, how to earn Maranzano's trust while preparing for betrayal. His genius was patience. He waited for the right moment, knowing that true power did not come from seizing control recklessly, but from letting others destroy themselves first. This period was the crucible that hardened him, forcing him to embrace the darker side of his psychology. Fear became more than a weapon, it became a philosophy. He began to understand that to truly dominate, a leader must never be predictable. The possibility of violence, the aura of menace, was more effective than the act itself. Another important lesson came from his time with Lansky and Siegel in the bootlegging trade. They had to move liquor across city lines, guard it against hijackers, and pay off the right officials. Luciano noticed that most gangs failed because they ruled through brute force alone. Hijackers killed rivals and left bloody messages, but in doing so they drew attention from the police. Luciano instead applied discipline. His crew operated with rules, schedules, and payoffs. If someone betrayed him, they vanished quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. He learned that fear worked best when it didn't cause chaos, but when it created silence. The absence of noise was more terrifying than a public killing spree. The way Luciano carried himself also reflected this psychological balance. He was not the kind of gangster who shouted orders or threw temper tantrums. Instead, he was calm, deliberate, and charismatic. He dressed in fine suits, spoke softly, and often smiled in conversations. But beneath the charm was a steel edge everyone could feel. His associates described him as the kind of man who could joke with you one moment and calmly order your death the next. That duality, warmth mixed with menace, kept people on edge. They never quite knew where they stood, and that uncertainty was its own form of control. By the end of the 1920s, Luciano had carved out a reputation as something different. He wasn't just another mobster trying to make a fast buck. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a man who saw beyond the present fight. His early lessons in psychology, fear, and power would culminate in his betrayal of Masuria and Maranzano, But even before those famous coups, the foundations were clear. He was redefining what it meant to be a gangster in America. No longer would it be about family honor and endless vendettas. It would be about efficiency, profit, and the mastery of fear. This chapter of his life closes with an image of Luciano walking the streets of New York, a young man already seen as dangerous, yet always smiling, always polite. His genius was beginning to emerge, not in bloodshed alone, but in the way he understood people better than they understood themselves. Fear, he realized, was not about terrorizing everyone all the time. It was about choosing the right moments, applying just enough pressure, and leaving people haunted by the idea that crossing him was not an option. That insight, forged in the streets and sharpened by war, would make him the architect of an empire. The Castellamarese War marked the violent climax of old-world mafia traditions clashing with the reality of modern America. By the early 1930s, New York's underworld was drenched in blood. On one side stood Joe, the boss Masuria, greedy and arrogant, determined to remain the unquestioned ruler of Italian crime in the city. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, shrewd and calculating, who dreamed of reshaping the mafia into his personal Roman Empire, complete with titles and tributes. For years their soldiers filled the morgues, and their endless vendetta destabilized every racket. To most it was just another gang war, but to Charles "Lucky" Luciano, it was an opportunity, and an education in what not to do. Luciano had risen high enough in Masuria's ranks to see the rot from within. Masuria's approach to leadership was crude: demand loyalty, punish betrayal with death, and squeeze every racket for short-term profit. There was no vision, no strategy, just paranoia. Luciano understood that such leadership bred resentment and waste. It was during this time that he began to envision a completely different model of organized crime, one where violence was a last resort and profit and order reigned supreme. But first he had to survive the war and remove the dead weight of the old bosses. The turning point came when Luciano orchestrated the betrayal of his own boss. In 1931, after years of bloodshed, Luciano made a fateful decision. Masuria had to go. He pretended to remain loyal, gaining Masuria's trust while secretly negotiating with Maranzano. The setup was as cold as it was brilliant. Luciano arranged a card game at a Coney Island restaurant. As Masuria sat playing, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. In that moment, gunmen burst in: Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, and riddled Masuria with bullets. Luciano returned moments later, his hands clean, his future secured. It was a betrayal that shocked the underworld, but it cemented his reputation as a strategist who could combine patience, deception, and ruthless efficiency. With Masuria gone, Maranzano emerged as the new boss. At first, Luciano saw promise in his vision of restructuring the mafia, but it didn't take long for disillusionment to set in. Maranzano demanded absolute control, styling himself the boss of bosses, a Caesar-like figure at the top of a rigid pyramid. He divided the New York mafia into 5 families, assigning bosses to each, but he kept himself above them all. For a man like Luciano, who believed in cooperation and balance, this arrogance was intolerable. Worse, Luciano learned that Maranzano had marked him for death, fearing the young upstart's ambition. Luciano struck first. Using his network of Jewish associates who were less visible to Sicilian loyalists, he arranged Maranzano's assassination. In September 1931, a team of killers disguised as government agents stormed Maranzano's office. They stabbed and shot him to death, ending his reign before it could solidify. In a single year, Luciano had eliminated both Masuria and Maranzano, the last of the old-world bosses. The underworld was now wide open, and into that vacuum stepped Luciano, not as another dictator, but as an architect of something entirely new. His genius was in rejecting the concept of a boss of bosses. He recognized that concentrating all power in one man only invited paranoia, betrayal, and instability. Instead, Luciano proposed a commission, a governing council of the 5 families of New York, along with representatives from powerful families across the country. It was a board of directors for organized crime, modeled on corporate structures rather than feudal ones. Disputes would be mediated collectively, wars avoided through arbitration, and profits shared rather than squandered in blood feuds. It was the birth of modern organized crime in America, and it bore Luciano's fingerprints at every level. The creation of the commission was not just structural, it was psychological. Luciano understood that if bosses feared being dominated by one man, they would resist. But if they were given a seat at the table, a voice in decisions, they would buy into the system. By making his rivals stakeholders rather than subjects, Luciano defused rebellion before it could take shape. He replaced fear of dictatorship with fear of exclusion, and in the underworld, exclusion meant vulnerability, bankruptcy, or death. The commission ensured that no single family could act recklessly without facing collective punishment, a system of checks and balances that kept order far more effectively than brute force ever had. Beyond structure, Luciano's reforms extended to operations. He professionalized crime, standardizing rules and diversifying rackets. No longer would Italian gangs fight endless wars with Jewish or Irish crews. Under Luciano's vision, cooperation meant greater profits. Everyone would have a share in bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and labor racketeering. Violence was permitted only when necessary, and even then it was to be strategic, not wasteful. He enforced discipline through a mixture of fear and respect. Break the rules and you were removed quietly without spectacle. Follow them and you would thrive. To politicians and law enforcement, Luciano's reforms were invisible at first. But to the underworld they were revolutionary. Instead of chaos there was order. Instead of endless vendettas there was stability. Luciano had created a true criminal empire, one that could outlast any single man. He was not simply another gangster. He was an engineer of systems, a strategist who reshaped the very DNA of organized crime in America. The irony, of course, was that Luciano achieved this transformation through betrayal and murder, the very tools of the old bosses he despised. Yet unlike them, he used these tools with purpose as stepping stones toward something larger. He killed not out of pride or revenge but out of necessity, to clear the path for his new order. This cold pragmatism was the essence of his genius, and it terrified his rivals. They knew Luciano's smile hid a mind willing to sacrifice anyone for the greater stability of the empire. By 1932, Luciano was at the height of his power. He sat at the center of a nationwide criminal network, surrounded by trusted allies like Lansky, Siegel, Costello, and Genovese, each man holding a crucial role in the machine. The underworld, once fractured and chaotic, was now streamlined and efficient, its profits greater than ever. And behind it all was Luciano's vision. A new kind of mafia, engineered like a corporation, governed by rules and sustained by fear. This section closes with the image of Luciano as a young man in his 30s, impeccably dressed, confident, and untouchable. He had dismantled the old order, created something unprecedented, and established himself as the architect of American organized crime. His rise was complete, but it was only the beginning. The systems he built would endure for decades, long after his own fate was sealed. In the genius of his reforms, and in the fear that enforced them, Luciano had become more than a gangster. He was the modern face of the mafia. Fear was the air the mafia breathed, but in Lucky Luciano's world, it was refined into something deeper, subtler, and more enduring. At the heart of this was omerta, the Sicilian code of silence, a tradition that had survived centuries, carried from the dusty villages of Sicily to the crowded streets of New York. Omerta was more than a rule, it was a cultural law, a moral chain that bound men together and smothered dissent. For Luciano, it became the invisible backbone of his empire. But unlike the old bosses who clung to it blindly, Luciano reshaped omerta into a weapon, blending ancient fear with modern psychology. Omerta promised loyalty above all. To break it was to bring death not only upon oneself but often upon one's family. This knowledge alone kept most men obedient. Yet Luciano understood that fear of death wasn't always enough. Men were weak. They cracked under pressure, under interrogation, under the threat of prison. So he added layers. He made omerta not just about silence in the face of the police, but about silence in every transaction, every deal, every betrayal. His soldiers learned that to speak too much, to show too much ambition, was dangerous. Words became liabilities. Silence became survival. In this way, fear did not need to be shouted. It seeped into daily life, an unspoken rule that haunted every corner of his organization. But Luciano's brilliance lay in balancing fear with incentives. He knew men would not remain silent forever if they felt cheated. Unlike some of the older bosses, he made sure his soldiers were paid well, that they saw the benefits of loyalty. Omerta was not just enforced through the barrel of a gun, it was reinforced through profit. A man who prospered under Luciano had more to lose by talking than by staying quiet. This mixture of carrot and stick was what made his system resilient. One story told among his associates was how Luciano handled suspected leaks. Where other bosses would react impulsively, killing the accused immediately, Luciano would investigate, weigh the evidence, and often bide his time. Sometimes he let a man stew in paranoia for weeks, uncertain if his fate was sealed. The silence, the waiting, the dread, that was the punishment before the bullet ever came. And when the execution did happen, it was clean, swift, and often invisible to the public. The effect was chilling. Men didn't just fear death, they feared the possibility of death, a slow psychological erosion that kept them obedient without Luciano having to act constantly. Omerta also extended beyond the mafia's ranks. Luciano was a master at using fear to silence outsiders, witnesses, business partners, even politicians. Bribes were offered first, of course, but behind every payment was an unspoken threat. A judge who accepted an envelope of cash knew what would happen if he suddenly found a conscience. A businessman who profited from a deal with Luciano's crew also knew the cost of betrayal. Fear was not a gun pointed at the head. It was the weight of understanding that defiance carried consequences that would ripple into family, reputation, and livelihood. This psychological mastery of Omerta also transformed the mafia's relationship with the community. On the surface, gangsters often portrayed themselves as protectors, defenders of Italian neighborhoods against exploitation. They attended weddings, baptized children, handed out turkeys at Christmas. But beneath the generosity was control. A shopkeeper who accepted a gift from Luciano's men understood that he was also accepting their rules. If the police came asking questions, he would keep his mouth shut. Fear was wrapped in gratitude, and gratitude wrapped in fear, an endless cycle that kept communities bound to the mafia's silence. Luciano's approach to Omerta also reveals his pragmatism. He was not bound by romantic notions of Sicilian honor. To him, the code was a tool, not a sacred oath. He bent it when it suited him, especially when it came to his alliances with Jewish and Irish partners. Traditionalists bristled at this, believing Omerta applied only to men of honor, meaning Sicilians. Luciano discarded that thinking. His Omerta was about silence, period. Ethnicity did not matter. What mattered was discipline, obedience, and the understanding that breaking trust would lead to destruction. In this way, he modernized an ancient code and made it fit the realities of American crime. The fear of betrayal haunted even the highest levels of Luciano's empire. Men like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Meyer Lansky were his closest allies, but even they operated under the shadow of Omerta. They might strategize and argue, but they knew the boundaries of loyalty. Luciano created an environment where betrayal was unthinkable because the psychological cost was too great. Men learned not just to obey but to internalize obedience, to silence their doubts and ambitions before they ever reached their lips. That was his real genius. He made fear self-sustaining. This invisible system of control outlasted even Luciano himself. Decades later, mafiosi still invoked Omerta, still clung to the silence Luciano had weaponized. The FBI would struggle for years to break through it, only succeeding when wiretaps and undercover operations replaced the need for human testimony. Until then, Omerta shielded the mafia like armor, a cultural force stronger than bullets. And at its height, it worked because Luciano had perfected its psychology, turning silence into both a tradition and a strategy. This section closes by reflecting on the paradox. Omerta was both the mafia's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. It bound men together, but it also left them isolated, trapped in fear. For Luciano, this was the genius of fear in action. He understood that men controlled by fear of betrayal were more loyal than men controlled by honor. Honor could fade, but fear never left. It was the invisible chain that held his empire together, an empire built not only on money and violence but on silence, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had built more than just a criminal network. He had engineered a corporation in the shadows, one that rivaled the great American enterprises of the era. To the casual observer, the mafia was still gangs of thugs running gambling dens and bootlegging liquor. But to insiders, Luciano's empire looked like a boardroom. Rules, hierarchy, division of labor, and a relentless pursuit of profit. Crime in his hands became business. And business was booming. At the center of this empire was diversification. Unlike the old bosses who clung to a single racket, Luciano spread risk across multiple industries. Gambling was the foundation. Horse racing, dice games, and poker tables supplied steady cash, with police and politicians on payroll to ensure raids never disrupted operations. Prostitution was another cornerstone, generating millions from brothels hidden behind legitimate fronts. Luciano treated it like a regulated trade, organizing madams, enforcers, and protection as if it were a union. He even enforced rules. No exploitation of children, no random street walking. A controlled system, brutal but efficient. Bootlegging, which had fueled the mafia during Prohibition, evolved under Luciano into international smuggling. When alcohol became legal again in 1933, others saw collapse, but Luciano pivoted. He shifted resources into narcotics, heroin and morphine smuggled from Europe and Asia through ports in New York. Drugs were dangerous, risky, and despised by older mafiosi, but Luciano saw the profit margins and could not resist. He did not sell directly to users. Instead, he built pipelines distributing to mid-level dealers who took the legal risks while his organization collected steady returns. It was vertical integration in crime, years before Wall Street celebrated the concept. Labor racketeering became another pillar. With men like Frank Costello, Luciano infiltrated unions, particularly the docks and construction trades. Control of the unions meant control of the city's arteries, ports, supplies, contracts. Businessmen who wanted shipments to arrive on time, or construction projects to run smoothly, had to pay. Politicians who wanted peace with labor leaders were forced to negotiate through mafia channels. It was less bloody than gambling or prostitution, but in many ways more powerful, a stranglehold on the city's very infrastructure. What made this empire different was organization. Luciano's underworld mirrored legitimate corporate America. He set up what looked like departments: finance, enforcement, logistics. Men like Vito Genovese managed narcotics, Lansky handled investments and laundering, Costello cultivated politicians, and Siegel oversaw enforcement and expansion. Luciano acted as chairman of the board, delegating authority but maintaining ultimate oversight. Each man was enriched by the system, which meant they had every reason to stay loyal. This decentralization also protected Luciano. If one racket was hit by law enforcement, the others continued without collapse. Luciano also pioneered money laundering at a scale never seen before. Cash from gambling and vice flowed into restaurants, construction companies, and offshore accounts. With Lansky's brilliance in finance, Luciano ensured that dirty money appeared legitimate. This allowed reinvestment in both legal and illegal ventures, blurring the line between the two. Ordinary citizens might dine at a restaurant or stay in a hotel funded by mafia profits, never knowing they were feeding the empire. Fear and violence still underpinned the system, but in Luciano's empire they were tools of efficiency, not chaos. Murders were sanctioned by the commission, carried out only when necessary, and designed to send clear messages. Gone were the days of random street killings. Luciano enforced a culture where violence served profit, never ego. This discipline allowed his empire to appear less like a gang and more like a shadow government, invisible but unavoidable. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's criminal corporation was generating millions annually, an astonishing sum in Depression-era America. In a city where unemployment soared and breadlines stretched for blocks, Luciano and his associates lived like kings. Yet they were careful to avoid flaunting excess. Expensive suits, yes, flashy cars sometimes. But never enough to provoke unnecessary scrutiny. Luciano's genius was in blending in, presenting himself as a successful businessman while orchestrating an empire that reached from Manhattan's nightclubs to international smuggling routes. The genius of fear was still at play. Associates knew they could become rich beyond their dreams under Luciano's system, but they also knew the cost of betrayal. This balance kept his business machine humming. He had turned crime into commerce, vice into industry, and brutality into efficiency. For Luciano, the streets of New York were not battlefields anymore. They were markets, and he was the CEO of the American underworld. All empires, no matter how carefully built, exist within webs of shifting alliances and looming betrayals. For Lucky Luciano, the 1930s were a period of unrivaled power, but also of delicate balance. His empire thrived not only on money and fear, but on the ability to manage people. Friends, rivals, allies, and enemies, each with their own ambitions and egos. It was a constant game of chess, and Luciano played it with unmatched skill, though even he could not control every piece forever. At his side were allies who seemed more like partners than subordinates. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, was perhaps his most important. Costello's genius was politics, bribing judges, cultivating police captains, and securing favors from Tammany Hall politicians who ran New York. Where Luciano wielded fear, Costello wielded charm. Together they ensured that the mafia was not just a criminal empire but a political force with tentacles in City Hall and Albany. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the quiet accountant with a razor-sharp mind for numbers. While not Italian and therefore barred from official membership in the mafia, Lansky was indispensable. He laundered Luciano's fortune through legitimate fronts, invested in casinos, and even forged connections in Havana, Cuba, the first seeds of what would later become the mafia's global expansion. To Luciano, Lansky was proof that old ethnic barriers were useless in the modern underworld. Money and loyalty mattered more than bloodlines. Vito Genovese, however, embodied the darker side of Luciano's circle. Ambitious, ruthless, and never satisfied, Genovese was both an ally and a threat. Luciano relied on him as an enforcer and strategist, but he understood Genovese's hunger for power. It was only a matter of time before that ambition would turn inward, aiming at Luciano himself. Genovese represented the eternal mafia problem. Even the most loyal allies could not be trusted forever. Beyond his inner circle, Luciano cultivated relationships with Jewish gangsters like Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who handled enforcement with terrifying efficiency, and Dutch Schultz, a volatile figure who became both ally and problem. Schultz's empire in Harlem and the Bronx was lucrative, but his recklessness worried Luciano. When Schultz proposed assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a plan that would have brought devastating law enforcement attention, Luciano made a decision that proved his pragmatism. He ordered Schultz eliminated. In 1935, Schultz was gunned down in a Newark tavern, not by rivals but by Luciano's men. It was a reminder that alliances were conditional, and anyone threatening the stability of the empire had to be removed, even if they were profitable. The commission, Luciano's greatest innovation, also became a theater of alliances and rivalries. Families across the country, in Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, and beyond, participated, but unity was fragile. Al Capone's Chicago outfit, though diminished after Capone's imprisonment, remained powerful, and their cooperation was essential. In Cleveland, Mo Dalitz ran gambling operations with Lansky's guidance, feeding profits back to the national network. In Buffalo and Detroit, families were integrated into the commission system. Yet every boss harbored suspicions, and Luciano had to maintain a balance of fear and respect to keep the peace. Enemies also came from outside the underworld. Law enforcement, emboldened by political pressure, began targeting racketeering operations. District Attorney Thomas Dewey, the same man Schultz had wanted to kill, emerged as Luciano's most relentless adversary. Dewey was incorruptible, ambitious, and determined to make his name by dismantling organized crime. Unlike pliable police captains, Dewey could not be bribed or charmed. For the first time, Luciano faced an enemy whose persistence rivaled his own patience. But the most dangerous enemies were often invisible, whispers of betrayal from within. Genovese's ambitions grew bolder, and rumors spread that he was quietly undermining Luciano's authority. Others feared that Lansky's growing influence might upset the balance between Italian and Jewish factions. And though Costello remained loyal, his ties to politicians made him a target for rivals who saw him as a liability. Luciano managed these tensions by offering rewards, making concessions, and, when necessary, using quiet threats. He was less a dictator and more a broker, keeping the machine stable by ensuring no one piece grew powerful enough to topple the rest. The genius of Luciano's alliances lay in his ability to see beyond ethnicity, ego, and tradition. He understood that survival required cooperation, with Jews, with Irish, with corrupt politicians, with anyone who could bring profit and protection. But this openness also invited dangers. Rivals resented his breaking of old codes, traditionalists whispered that he had corrupted the mafia by mingling with outsiders, and younger men like Genovese plotted for the day when they could inherit his empire. By the late 1930s, Luciano was walking a tightrope. His empire was vast, his allies powerful, but the web he had spun grew more complex with every new deal. Each alliance was a strand that held the empire together, but also one that could snap under the weight of ambition or betrayal. The very system he had created, efficient, profitable, modern, was also fragile, reliant on loyalty in a world where loyalty was always temporary. In the end, Luciano's mastery of alliances bought him time, but not immunity. The enemies circling him, prosecutors, rivals, even friends, would eventually converge. The empire he had built was too visible, too profitable, and too modern to remain untouched forever. This was the paradox of power in the mafia. The higher one climbed, the more delicate the balance became. Luciano had made himself indispensable, but he had also made himself the biggest target in the underworld. By the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his empire. His reforms had stabilized the mafia, his alliances stretched across America, and his profits soared into the millions. To the outside world, he was untouchable, the quiet mastermind who had transformed chaos into order. Yet, in the shadows, his enemies gathered. The fall of Lucky Luciano did not come through a bloody gunfight or a rival boss's betrayal. It came through something far less glamorous, the slow, methodical hand of the law, pushed forward by ambition and timing, and aided by betrayals that cut deeper than any bullet. At the center of this downfall was one man, Thomas E. Dewey. Young, ambitious, and incorruptible, Dewey had made a name for himself as a crime-busting prosecutor in Manhattan. Unlike politicians and judges who had long been on Luciano's payroll, Dewey refused bribes and ignored threats. He saw the mafia as a disease eating at the city and believed that bringing down its most powerful figurehead would elevate his own political career. For Dewey, Luciano was not just a gangster. He was the prize that would propel him toward the governor's mansion, and perhaps even the White House. Dewey's opportunity came from a world many mafiosi dismissed: prostitution. Luciano's empire controlled one of the largest prostitution rings in the country, a network of brothels stretching across New York and beyond. To Luciano it was business no different from gambling or bootlegging. But to Dewey it was a point of leverage. Prostitution carried a social stigma that gambling did not. More importantly, it provided witnesses, women who could be pressured, threatened, or persuaded into testifying. And unlike hardened gangsters bound by omerta, these women were vulnerable, isolated, and often eager to trade testimony for leniency. The investigation began quietly, with raids on brothels linked to Luciano's associates. One by one, madams and prostitutes were arrested, interrogated, and pushed into cooperation. Dewey's prosecutors built a case not on direct evidence of Luciano's hand in prostitution, but on a web of testimony that placed him at the top of the system. The irony was that Luciano himself rarely dealt with the details of the racket. He had managers, collectors, and enforcers for that. But in Dewey's narrative, Luciano was the CEO of Vice, the man who profited from the exploitation of hundreds of women. What made the case particularly dangerous for Luciano was the betrayal from within his own ranks. Some of the very people who had profited from his system began to talk, subtly undermining the code of omerta. Fear, once Luciano's most powerful weapon, began to crack under the pressure of Dewey's relentless pursuit. Stories circulated that certain lieutenants, facing decades in prison, had quietly shared information with prosecutors. Luciano may not have known the full extent, but he sensed the walls closing in. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. In 1936, Luciano was lured into custody while traveling in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a town notorious for shielding gangsters. For once, his influence failed him. Local authorities, pressured by Dewey's office and the national spotlight, refused to release him despite the mafia's attempts at bribery and intimidation. From there, Luciano was extradited to New York to face trial. For the underworld, the news was shocking. Luciano, the man who had outmaneuvered Masuria and Maranzano, who had built the commission, who had made himself untouchable, was now sitting in a jail cell. To his allies, it was a moment of fear and uncertainty. Could the empire survive without its architect? To his enemies, it was a moment of triumph. Proof that even the strongest gangster could fall when confronted by the machinery of the state. Yet even in his arrest, Luciano displayed the calm pragmatism that defined his career. He did not rant or curse the system. He did not beg or grovel. Instead, he maintained a quiet confidence as if imprisonment were just another challenge to be managed. He continued to send instructions to his men, reassured his allies, and projected strength. But beneath the surface, the reality was inescapable. For the first time, Luciano was not in control. The betrayal cut deeper than the prison bars. Luciano had always believed that fear would keep his empire safe, that omerta would silence the weak. But now, witnesses lined up to testify against him, each one a crack in the wall of silence he had built. Prostitutes recounted stories of payoffs, beatings, and collections. Some spoke of Luciano's direct involvement, whether true or exaggerated. Dewey did not need absolute truth. He needed a convincing story for the jury. And piece by piece that story came together. The fall of Luciano was not the fall of his empire, at least not yet. His lieutenants continued the operations, the commission remained intact, and profits still flowed. But the arrest marked the beginning of the end for Luciano himself. It was the moment when myth collided with reality, when the architect of modern organized crime discovered that even the strongest fortress could be breached, not by bullets, but by subpoenas, testimony, and political will. For the mafia, Luciano's arrest was a lesson. Power could buy influence, silence, and fear, but it could not buy immunity forever. For Luciano, it was the first step toward exile, a long descent from the pinnacle of power to the uncertainty of prison and later banishment. His empire had been built on control, and now for the first time he had lost it. This was the beginning of the unraveling, the slow erosion of a legend. The man who had made the mafia into a corporation, who had outsmarted every rival, now faced a new kind of enemy, one he could not simply bribe, intimidate, or eliminate. Lucky Luciano, the genius of fear, had met his reckoning. The trial of Charles Lucky Luciano in 1936 was not just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle, a battle of wills between the most powerful gangster in America and a prosecutor determined to carve his name into history. 4 months, newspapers splashed his face across front pages, portraying him as the Vice King of New York, a man whose empire of gambling, racketeering, and above all prostitution had corrupted the very fabric of the city. For Luciano, who had built his legend on silence and shadows, the blinding spotlight of the courtroom was a new battlefield, one where bullets were replaced by testimony and fear was replaced by evidence. Thomas E. Dewey orchestrated the case like theater. He understood the public's hunger for drama, and he played his role as the fearless reformer to perfection. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, spectators, and curious onlookers. Each witness was a piece of his narrative: prostitutes, madams, pimps, and collectors, all testifying that Luciano was not just a participant, but the mastermind behind a vast network of brothels. Their stories painted him as cold, efficient, and ruthless, a man who treated human lives like numbers in a ledger. The irony was that Luciano rarely dealt with prostitutes directly. He was too high up, too careful. But Dewey didn't need physical evidence or direct involvement. He needed a story that convinced the jury, and the testimony he gathered provided it. Women spoke of beatings, of money collected in Luciano's name, of orders passed down through layers of lieutenants. Some accounts were likely exaggerated or shaped by prosecutors, but in the courtroom perception was as powerful as truth. Dewey framed Luciano not as a distant figure, but as the CEO of Vice, the man who profited while others suffered. Luciano's defense team attacked the credibility of the witnesses. They pointed out inconsistencies, questioned motives, and highlighted the deals some women had been offered in exchange for testimony. But the tide of public opinion was against him. The newspapers portrayed him as a symbol of moral corruption, a foreign gangster poisoning the city's youth. The climate of the 1930s, with its puritanical streak and growing concern about organized crime, meant that Luciano was fighting more than prosecutors, he was fighting America's sense of morality itself. Inside the courtroom, Luciano remained composed. He dressed impeccably, spoke calmly, and denied every accusation. To jurors and journalists alike, he projected an air of confidence, as though the trial were just another business negotiation. Yet behind that composure was a recognition that this battle was unlike anything he had faced before. He could not bribe the jury. He could not intimidate Dewey. His weapons, fear and loyalty, were useless here. The turning point came when Dewey delivered his summation. In a fiery address, he called Luciano the most dangerous criminal in the United States, accusing him of treating women like merchandise and mocking the defense's claims of innocence. Dewey's words were sharp, moralistic, and theatrical, designed not just for the jury, but for the front pages of every newspaper in America. It was a performance as much as a legal argument, and it resonated deeply. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, the courtroom erupted. Luciano, the man who had survived betrayals, assassinations, and wars, had finally been defeated by the law. Judge Philip J. McCook sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison, an extraordinary punishment, one of the harshest ever handed to a mob boss in that era. The sentence was meant not only to punish Luciano but to send a message: no gangster, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of justice. For Luciano, the verdict was both a humiliation and a revelation. He had built his empire on the belief that the mafia was untouchable, shielded by silence, loyalty, and fear. Now he sat in chains, condemned by the very people he had once dismissed as weak and unreliable, women who had dared to speak. It was proof that his system, for all its brilliance, was not invincible. Omerta had worked with men hardened by blood and fear, but not with those on society's margins, those who had little to lose and everything to gain by testifying. The trial also marked a turning point in America's war on organized crime. Dewey became a national hero, hailed as the man who brought down Lucky Luciano. His victory propelled him to higher political office, setting the stage for his run at the presidency. Law enforcement across the country took note. The mafia was not untouchable and its leaders could be brought to justice. For Luciano, who had once been the architect of order, it was a bitter irony. His very success in organizing crime had made him visible, traceable, and ultimately vulnerable. But even in defeat, Luciano remained a figure of fascination. Reporters described his stoic demeanor as he was led away in handcuffs, still dapper, still proud, refusing to bow his head. To the underworld, his conviction was both a warning and a paradox. The boss was gone, but the machine he had built remained. His lieutenants carried on operations, the commission continued to meet, and profits still flowed. Luciano had lost his freedom, but the mafia had not lost its power. The trial and sentence revealed the limits of fear as a tool of control. Fear could silence men, but it could not silence history, morality, or the relentless ambition of a prosecutor like Dewey. Luciano's empire had been built on the shadows, but once dragged into the light of a courtroom, its foundations were exposed. This was not just the fall of a man, but the collision of two forces: the old-world mafia ruled by silence and blood, and modern America ruled by law and public opinion. For Luciano, the prison gates closed not just on his body, but on the myth of invulnerability he had cultivated. The genius of fear had brought him to power, but it could not save him from a jury's verdict. His reign as the most powerful gangster in America was over, or so it seemed. Behind the towering walls of Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, Lucky Luciano's life should have been over. Stripped of his freedom, condemned to decades behind bars, he was supposed to vanish into obscurity. Yet Luciano was not the kind of man to fade quietly. Even from prison, he proved that the true measure of power was not the freedom to walk the streets, but the ability to make decisions that rippled far beyond the iron bars. Luciano's cell was small, austere, and gray, but in the invisible geography of influence, he still sat at the center of the mafia's map. His underlings continued to visit him under the guise of legal consultations or family business. Each meeting became a coded conversation, words chosen carefully, gestures holding layered meaning. Through lawyers, relatives, and trusted lieutenants, instructions flowed outward, keeping the commission alive and reminding everyone that the boss, though confined, still reigned. The prison itself became a curious stage. Guards, some loyal to their duty, others seduced by bribes, turned a blind eye when messages were smuggled in or when Luciano's associates slipped him newspapers marked with hidden notes. He used these channels to monitor the balance of power in New York. Who was growing too ambitious, who was loyal, who needed a warning. Prison had changed the tools at his disposal, but not the game itself. His genius lay in adaptation, in turning obstacles into opportunities. During World War II, Luciano's influence took an even stranger turn. The U.S. government, desperate to secure New York's docks from Nazi sabotage, reached out to the imprisoned Don. The mafia controlled the longshoremen's unions, and only Luciano could guarantee cooperation. In exchange for his help, his sentence conditions were eased, granting him privileges and influence that most inmates could only dream of. Here was the paradox of Luciano: a convicted criminal, condemned as the architect of vice, suddenly becoming a secret partner of the state. It was an unholy alliance, born of necessity, and it confirmed what Luciano always believed: power could bend even the strongest institutions. In the underworld, his incarceration became a myth. For some, it was proof of his invincibility. If Luciano could still pull strings from a cage, then perhaps the mafia was truly eternal. For others, it was a reminder of the limits of fear. Rivals tested the edges of his authority, wondering if the boss was still sharp or if prison had dulled his reach. But each time, Luciano demonstrated his hand. A deal struck here, a threat delivered there, all reminding them that his mind remained as dangerous as ever. Psychologically, prison forced him into reflection. No longer able to roam the nightlife of Manhattan or command face-to-face, he began to think more like a strategist, a chess player watching from afar. His focus shifted from the immediacy of violence to the preservation of structure. The commission, his greatest invention, was proof of his foresight. It ensured that no single arrest, not even his own, could collapse the organization. His presence behind bars became symbolic, the ghostly hand guiding a machine that outlived him. But Luciano also knew that the walls were closing in. He had lost the freedom to enforce his will directly. He depended on loyalty, on the very fear and respect he had cultivated years earlier. Without those, he was powerless. Every message that left his cell carried a risk of distortion, betrayal, or exposure. His empire continued, but it was no longer fully his. Prison was teaching him the slow erosion of control. Still, even diminished, Luciano's shadow loomed large. Politicians and gangsters alike invoked his name. Journalists speculated about his hidden influence, painting him as a phantom king of crime. In truth, he was both weaker and stronger than they imagined, trapped in a cell yet shaping events on the docks, guiding the mafia's future and proving that fear, once instilled deeply enough, could outlast bars and chains. For Luciano, power behind bars was a contradiction, a reminder of both his brilliance and his vulnerability. He had bent the rules of the underworld, bent the law itself, and now even the prison system was not immune to his touch. But he also knew that the clock was ticking. The trial had ended his illusion of invincibility, prison was eroding his direct command. The mafia could survive his absence, but the man himself was slowly becoming a prisoner not just of the state but of time. The genius of fear had carried him into prison as a legend. It would keep his influence alive for years. But it could not change the inevitable. Even Lucky Luciano, the man who once controlled New York like a king, was no longer truly free. When the prison gates of Dannemora finally opened for Charles Lucky Luciano, he did not walk out as a free man. His deal with the U.S. government during World War II had bought him leniency but not redemption. In 1946, after a decade behind bars, Luciano was paroled on the condition that he would be deported immediately. He stepped onto a ship bound for Italy, never again to walk the streets of New York that he had once ruled. For a man who had created the very blueprint of modern organized crime, exile was both a punishment and a bitter humiliation. He had built an empire in America, and now America had cast him out. Italy greeted him not with reverence but suspicion. To the authorities, he was a dangerous foreigner returning with notoriety and a criminal reputation. To the mafia in Sicily, he was not the king they had imagined, but a man disconnected from their struggles, shaped by a world across the ocean. Luciano settled in Naples, a city alive with black markets, corruption, and post-war desperation. He tried to carve out a place for himself, but exile weighed heavily. America had been his stage. Italy felt like a cage without bars, a land where his power was more memory than reality. Yet Luciano was not ready to fade. Almost immediately, he began building connections, exploring opportunities to reassert his influence. Naples, riddled with poverty and hunger, was fertile ground for smuggling, cigarettes, narcotics, anything that could turn desperation into profit. Luciano became linked to the burgeoning heroin trade, orchestrating networks that moved drugs from Europe into the United States through secret channels. While he could no longer walk into New York nightclubs or sit at the commission's table, his fingerprints remained on operations that stretched across oceans. Cuba offered him a tantalizing chance at resurgence. In 1946, he managed to slip into Havana, using bribery and connections to evade restrictions on his travel. There he reconnected with his old ally Meyer Lansky, who had turned Havana into a glittering playground of casinos, nightclubs, and American tourism. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Luciano was back in the heart of power. He attended meetings with American mobsters, celebrated his return, and reveled in the taste of leadership he had lost. In Havana, he was treated once more as the legendary Don, the architect of the commission, the man whose name still commanded respect. But his time in Cuba was short-lived. The U.S. government, alarmed by reports of his activities, pressured Cuban authorities to expel him. Within months he was forced back to Italy, stripped once again of the power he had tried to reclaim. It was a crushing blow. For the first time, Luciano seemed to grasp that no matter how clever, no matter how feared, he was no longer untouchable. America had slammed its doors forever. Back in Naples, Luciano settled into a strange twilight existence. He lived in comfort, often surrounded by admirers and old friends, yet always under the watchful eye of Italian police. He was no longer the man who decided the fate of gangsters in New York, but neither was he forgotten. His name carried weight, whispered in underworld circles, studied by law enforcement and mythologized by the public. He became less a player than a symbol, the embodiment of a golden age of organized crime that was already slipping into legend. Psychologically, the years of exile forced Luciano into reflection. He had once believed in the permanence of his empire, but now he saw the truth. Power is transient and fear, though potent, cannot survive time and distance. The men he had elevated were running the mafia without him. The world was changing. Narcotics were replacing gambling as the backbone of the underworld, and new bosses were rising who owed him nothing. Luciano was alive to witness his creation thrive, yet he was a spectator, not a ruler. His final years were marked by contradiction. He was both respected and irrelevant, both feared and pitied. He gave interviews, spoke with a kind of nostalgic pride about the system he had built, yet he carried the bitterness of a man who knew he would never set foot in the country that had made him legendary. For Luciano, exile was not just physical separation, it was psychological dislocation. He belonged to America's streets, not Naples' alleys. He had become a king without a kingdom. On January 26, 1962, Luciano's story came to its quiet end. At Naples' Capodichino airport, After meeting with a producer interested in making a film about his life, he collapsed from a heart attack and died instantly. He was 64 years old. The irony was profound. A man who had survived assassinations, gang wars, betrayals, and prison, a man whose life had been defined by violence and fear, was undone not by bullets but by his own heart. His death closed the chapter on one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in history. In exile, Luciano had learned the cruel lesson of power, that it is never absolute, never permanent. The genius of fear had carried him to the top of the American underworld, but it could not shield him from the forces of time, geography, and mortality. In Naples, far from the city he once ruled, Lucky Luciano died as both a man and a myth, remembered not for the final years of decline, but for the empire he had built, the order he had imposed, and the shadow he had cast across the criminal world. Lucky Luciano's story did not end with his death on a cold January day in Naples. If anything, that was merely the conclusion of the man. The myth, however, endured and grew stronger. His legacy was not confined to the streets he once ruled or the prison where he served his sentence. It stretched across generations, across continents, and into the very fabric of modern organized crime. More than any other figure of his time, Luciano was the architect of a system that outlived him, a man whose genius was not in brutality alone, but in organization, vision, and the psychology of control. Before Luciano, the mafia in America was chaotic, a loose collection of bosses clinging to ethnic loyalties, fighting wars that drained profits and bred instability. After Luciano, it became a machine, structured, disciplined, and frighteningly efficient. His creation of the commission was perhaps his greatest gift to the underworld. By formalizing cooperation between crime families, he reduced the endless cycle of vendettas. Disputes were settled at the table, not with bullets in the street. It was, in essence, a criminal board of directors, and it allowed the mafia to function more like a corporation than a gang. This system was so effective that it remained the backbone of American organized crime for decades. Even as new faces replaced the old, the Gambinos, the Genovese, the Colombos, the commission ensured continuity. Luciano's shadow was always there, in every meeting, every vote, every carefully balanced alliance. The bosses who came after him inherited not just his rules but also his philosophy, that fear was powerful but structure was eternal. Globally, his impact was no less profound. The narcotics pipelines that emerged after World War II linking Europe to the United States bore Luciano's fingerprints. His exile in Italy placed him at a crossroads between Sicilian mafia traditions and American innovations. Though he never again controlled operations directly, his presence helped to forge connections that would later blossom into the international heroin trade of the 1960s and 1970s. In this sense, Luciano's legacy extended beyond America. He had helped to globalize the mafia, laying the foundation for what would become a worldwide network of organized crime. Culturally, Luciano became a paradoxical figure. To law enforcement and reformers, he was the ultimate villain, the man who had corrupted cities and preyed on society's most vulnerable. To the underworld, he was a hero, a visionary who had brought order to chaos and elevated gangsters into businessmen. To the public, he was something in between, both feared and admired, despised and romanticized. Newspapers that once condemned him as a vice king later published nostalgic pieces about his golden age of crime. Filmmakers, novelists, and historians would later mine his story for inspiration, ensuring that his name became part of popular culture. Psychologically, Luciano represented something larger than crime. He embodied the immigrant struggle, the pursuit of power in a society that often closed doors to outsiders. For poor Italian kids growing up in the slums, his rise was proof that it was possible to claw one's way to the top, even if the cost was blood and lawlessness. For sociologists and criminologists, he became a case study in leadership, a man who ruled not by sheer violence but by understanding human behavior, by balancing loyalty and fear, by creating systems that made betrayal costly and obedience rewarding. Yet Luciano's legacy also carried darker lessons. His reliance on fear as the glue that held his empire together revealed both its strength and its fragility. Fear silenced men, but it could not silence the law, the press, or the inexorable march of time. The very system he created, designed to outlive him, proved that even the most brilliant leaders are replaceable. The mafia thrived without him, but that survival was itself a testament to his vision. He had built something greater than himself, a structure so solid it did not need its founder to continue. There is also the irony of his partnership, however indirect, with the U.S. government during World War II. Here was a man condemned as the embodiment of organized vice, yet when America needed the mafia's influence on the docks, they turned to Luciano. That moment blurred the lines between criminal and state power, showing that in the shadows of history, morality often gave way to pragmatism. Luciano's legacy, then, is not just about crime but about the uneasy intersections between power, fear, and necessity. When historians trace the arc of organized crime in the 20th century, they almost always arrive at the same conclusion. Luciano changed everything. He was not the most violent gangster, nor the richest, nor the most flamboyant. What set him apart was his ability to think like a strategist. He saw crime not as chaos but as business. He recognized that an empire built only on blood would collapse, but one built on order could endure. In this way he became less a gangster than a CEO of the underworld, a man whose boardroom was the backroom of nightclubs, whose contracts were written in silence, whose profits came soaked in fear. Even in death, his story continues to resonate. Luciano's funeral in Naples drew hundreds, a mixture of mourners, curious onlookers, and police. In America, mobsters who had once called him boss paused to remember. In the decades since, his name has appeared in countless books, films, and documentaries. Each retelling adds another layer to the myth, another angle on the man who once controlled the streets with invisible strings. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is therefore twofold. To the world of crime, he was the visionary architect who transformed gangs into institutions, ensuring their survival long after his exile. To society at large, he was a mirror, reflecting the complexities of power, fear, and ambition. He forced America to confront uncomfortable truths, about corruption, about the fragility of law, about how easily the line between respectability and criminality could blur. In the end, Luciano's genius was not just in the empire he built, but in the legacy he left behind. He proved that the underworld, if organized and disciplined, could rival the structures of legitimate society. And though time eventually reduced him to an exile, his ideas lived on, shaping generations of criminals, inspiring stories, and reminding the world that power built on fear can echo long after the man who wielded it is gone. The story of Charles Lucky Luciano is in many ways the story of America's uneasy dance with power, ambition, and fear. His life was not just a tale of crime but of transformation. A boy from the slums of Sicily who crossed the ocean with nothing, only to reshape the criminal landscape of the New World. By the time of his death, he had become both a man and a myth, and separating one from the other remains one of the enduring fascinations of his legacy. When we reflect on Luciano's rise, we see the classic immigrant narrative twisted into something darker. The son of poor parents, he learned early that survival required more than hard work. It required cunning, strategy, and the willingness to bend rules that others feared to touch. America offered opportunity, but for those on the margins, legitimate doors were often closed. Luciano forced his own doors open, through violence, through loyalty, through a ruthless understanding of human psychology. In this, his story resonates far beyond crime. It becomes a parable of ambition in a society that often left newcomers struggling at the edges. But his genius was not merely in seizing power, it was in reshaping it. Where other gangsters relied on brute force, Luciano understood systems. He recognized that blood feuds were bad for business, that chaos destroyed profits, and that an empire needed structure. His creation of the Commission transformed scattered families into a syndicate that operated with the efficiency of a corporation. It was an innovation so profound that even decades after his exile, the structure remained intact. He imposed order on disorder, rules on lawlessness, and in doing so he changed the face of organized crime forever. And yet, the very tools that lifted him up became the seeds of his downfall. Fear was his greatest weapon. It kept soldiers loyal, rivals cautious, and the underworld disciplined. But fear has limits. It can silence men, but it cannot silence women testifying in a courtroom. It can bend unions, but it cannot bend juries forever. It can keep rivals obedient, but it cannot stop governments from uniting against you. Luciano's reliance on fear worked in the streets, but in the courtroom and in exile, it was powerless. The trial that led to his imprisonment was more than a legal defeat. It was a symbolic reckoning. The empire he built on shadows was dragged into the light, and for the first time, he discovered that not even the most powerful mob boss was immune to the state's machinery. His sentencing, 30 to 50 years, was a death blow not just to his freedom, but to the myth of invincibility he had cultivated. The genius of fear, it turned out, could not shield him from the slow grind of law and public opinion. And yet, even in defeat, Luciano adapted. From prison he remained a phantom ruler, sending messages, influencing unions, even cooperating with the U.S. government during World War II. Exile in Italy did not erase his name. Havana gave him a fleeting taste of resurrection. Naples became his final stage. He was diminished, yes, but never irrelevant. This paradox, a man stripped of power yet never forgotten, is what makes his story linger. Psychologically, Luciano's arc is one of ambition colliding with inevitability. He rose because he understood people, their desires, their fears, their weaknesses. He fell because he could not control the larger forces of law, time, and exile. That tension between mastery and mortality is what gives his story its cinematic weight. The myth of Lucky Luciano remains powerful because it embodies contradictions. He was ruthless but visionary. He was a criminal who acted like a statesman. He brought order yet profited from chaos. He was a man exiled, yet remembered as if he still reigned. To his enemies he was a villain. To his allies a genius. To history he became something in between. The man who proved that power built on fear could rival legitimate institutions, but also the man who showed that such power could never last forever. As we close this story, we are left with questions that echo beyond the mafia. What is the true nature of power? Is it the ability to command fear in the moment, or the ability to build something that endures after you are gone? Luciano, in his brilliance and his downfall, offers both answers. His commission survived him, shaping crime for decades. His personal reign ended in exile, showing the fragility of even the strongest empire. In the end, the myth of Lucky Luciano overshadows the man. The myth is larger, cleaner, almost romantic, the gangster king who built the American mafia. The man, however, was more complicated. An exile, a strategist trapped by the very world he created, a human being undone not by bullets but by the quiet inevitability of time. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that power, whether criminal or legitimate, often rests on the same foundations: fear, loyalty, and structure. And it forces us to see that no matter how high a man climbs, he cannot escape mortality. Luciano's empire lived on, but the man himself died in an airport, far from the streets that made him. The genius of fear brought him everything: wealth, respect, and legend. But it could not save him from exile, from loneliness, or from the final collapse of his heart. In that contrast, between the myth of the invincible Don and the man who died alone, waiting for a taxi in Naples, lies the haunting power of his story. Lucky Luciano remains, to this day, the symbol of an era when organized crime became something more than street violence, when it became business, system, empire. His story is a reminder of what fear can build, and what it cannot protect. It is the story of a man who controlled everyone around him except, in the end, himself.